Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us at the Progressive Forum. We're the world's only expressly progressive lecture series, and we're based in Houston, Texas. I'm Randall Morton, founder of the Forum. We're excited to present Alexander Vindman, the man of conscience who reported President Trump's so-called perfect call, trying to extort Ukraine President Zelensky, which led to Trump's impeachment. In this live stream, Vindman shares insights on the Ukraine-Russian war and talks about his book, Here, Right Matters, An American Story. This is a passionate account of his immigrant childhood, his rise in a sterling military career to serve the National Security Council in the White House, with service at U.S. Embassies in Moscow and Kiev. I'm grateful to our sponsor who made the in-person event and this free live stream possible, the Beverly M. Manny Trust, with appreciation to her sons, Burton Manny and Neil Manny. Thank you so much. This live stream is a recorded version of our recent in-person event in Houston. You can view it on our website indefinitely. To purchase this important book at a discount, click the link under the screen, and our terrific partners at Blue Willow Bookshop will send you a copy. And I hope you'll consider a donation to the Progressive Forum, which is voluntary, starting as low as $5 on up to several thousand, to keep these free live streams going. Just click the donation link. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman was born in the Ukrainian Soviet Union. His father fled the Soviet Union, bringing son Alex and his brothers to Brooklyn, New York, where they started an American life from scratch. Vindman served in the military in South Korea and earned a Purple Heart in combat in the Iraq War. I give you Alexander Vindman. Welcome to Houston, and thanks for being here. And congratulations on your inspiring book.
Thank you. I'm pretty. This has been a very, very warm welcome, and I'm glad to have visited Houston and look forward to another trip back sometime in the future.
Yeah, you're working on a new book, and so we want to be first on the invitee list, inviter list.
Sounds
Thanks
good.
for that. I'd like to talk about your book first, and then the war. You open your book in the Situation Room, where you say you had been many times before that, quote, "You don't stop getting a kick out of it." Now, I cannot imagine getting a kick out of being in the Situation Room. So what's it like for you in the Situation Room? What details can you share? What's your day like? Do you commute like a regular work day, or do they give you a ride so you're on time, or
Sure.
Or what?
So the reason I got a kick out of walking the halls of the White House, the old executive office building, the Eisenhower building, is because those are hallowed halls. Preceding me, there were countless amazing public servants, national leaders, some of whom were known, some whom served in quiet professionalism, and I was honored to be able to walk in those footsteps. Turns out that at some point, some old timer told me that the office I was using, assigned, was occupied by Henry Kissinger at some point, like a long, long time ago. So that's kind of an interesting place to park myself for a year and a half. And then the White House Situation Room, the reason that some folks might remember it was when President Obama authorized the strike on Osama bin Laden, he monitored it from that room that I sat in, which I had chaired meetings in. I actually sat in the same seat that the presidents sit in when they convene kind of smaller type of venues. So it's pretty amazing that some immigrant kid from the former Soviet Union that grew up in Brooklyn, lieutenant colonel, gets to shepherd national security at a senior level. So yes, every day was pretty amazing. It was also 16-hour days, so it's kind of tiring too.
Yeah, so do they give you a ride, or you just expect to negotiate the traffic and get there on time?
So I had the benefit of having my identical twin brother with me. He was assigned to the White House as an attorney. He parked himself across the hall from me. So we commuted on HOV lanes into town. It worked out well. We call folks that ride in cars in the DC area slugs. So he was my own personal slug, slugging in with me on a daily basis.
I would be worried to death I'd be late.
It worked out okay. I mean, I think the feature, one of the interesting features of having my twin there is that we've been together for a long time, and we tend to kid around a lot. So every now and then, in the late hours when nobody else was around, we'd kind of maybe I'd punch him or something like that, and so only the security guys on the cameras would be like, "What are those guys doing again?"
In your book, you say it was your duty to report the president trying to extort Zelensky in that phone call. But you also say it was important to your ancestry. Tell us about your ancestry and your duty to them.
Sure. I think I'll start with the fact that in the military you swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So to me, I was fulfilling my oath in reporting or holding to account everybody, that's including the president. The president wasn't above the law, but to your kind of deeper question about family and ancestry, I spent quite a bit of time. The Trump is. We could probably even have this whole conversation without mentioning it, but I'll just get out of the way right now. Trump is a kind of a foil in the book. He's only a plot twist at some point in the story rather than a central figure. Most of the story I try to tell is the how. What was it in my background that armed me to navigate this perilous affair, to make the judgment calls I did, to not get tripped up, not get myself in trouble, try to do the right thing in the right way. And I think that starts for me with the deeper background of my family. We hail from Kiev. My family immigrated in 1979. My dad was 47 when we left. He himself was a refugee decades before in World War II. When the Nazis were attacking Kiev, his father, who was a military officer, warned his mother that the Nazis would not be stopped and would take Kiev, and warned him to flee. Now that grandfather didn't survive the war. He perished in the Battle of Kharkiv. And my dad and mom and my dad's sister managed to flee out of Kiev under attacks, Nazi attacks, strafing train stations, and got out before the Nazis actually seized the city. For those of you that are familiar with the history of the region, when the Nazis did seize the city, they conducted mass executions of Jews. In one particularly terrible incident, within really days of seizing the city, they collected 33,000 Jews and executed them by firing squad, not firing squad, but by by shooting them, 33,000 Jews in a massive kind of pit not too far away from the center of the city. So, it's pretty amazing that a large portion of Kiev's Jewish population was murdered. We managed to survive that. My dad survived the war and grew up in the Soviet Union, made some good decisions to bring us to the United States. And somehow all of that, going all the way back and coming full circle to July 25th, 2019, put me in a position to defend the United States, defend the Constitution.
But your grandparents, like you, had to make some big decisions under terrible pressure. Somehow, your grandmother got on a train, right? Found herself into a crowd of refugees to get on a train to escape the Nazis, and got creative.
That's right. So I guess things don't change that much in terms of the authoritarian regimes out of the Kremlin. But when she did manage to get on that train and it started heading northeast towards Moscow, Stalin was like, we don't want to deal with these refugees, and turned the trains right around. And somehow my grandmother made the courageous decision to follow the advice of her husband, who said, get out of the area. That's the only way you're going to survive. She got off a train and somehow managed to make it another, I guess it's got to be 1,000 miles from there to the Ural Mountains by train, by steamboat, by intermediate stops, and managed to get to security in the Ural Mountains. Something that I'm not sure if it's in the book, but the place where they spent the war, where my dad is a 9-year-old all the way through about 14, is that right? Through about 12, actually. No, 13, correction. It was a place called Cherbarkul kind of in the middle of nowhere, Ural Mountains, and I had a chance to visit it as a army attache in the area. I went out there because there was a tank brigade out there. It was kind of interesting to see what the Russians were up to in that area, but it's somewhat known only because about 10 years ago there was a meteor shower, and it was recorded on people's dash cams, and the population in the area was in a state of panic because it looked like it was an alien attack. So anyway, so I got a chance to visit this place.
So I think we need to remember the Great Famine and the Great Purge carried out by Stalin when we think about the Ukrainian people. I don't think there's enough history talked about, and this is the environment that your father grew up with. He survived the Great Famine and the Great Purge. That's
true. The Holodomor, which started in 1933 and continued on to 1934, resulted in estimates are as low as 1.5, but probably 3 or more million deaths. That was all to collectivize farms and break the land-holding peasantry of their holdings. And this is the kind of, again, some of these things seem to rhyme quite often. The same kind of regime, in a lot of ways, occupies the Kremlin today. A very Stalin-esque figure, except without the power, the might, the kind of ability to draw the Soviet Union to face off against the Nazis. Now Russia is the fascist regime, attacking its neighbors.
So your father plays a big part in your book. Got a wonderful immigrant story. I'm curious how you would describe the American dream, and how would it differ from your father's version of the American dream?
Well, at the age of 4, I guess I didn't make a choice about coming here. I could hail praises on my father for making that difficult decision. At the age of 47, grown adult, spent the bulk of his professional career working in the Soviet Union, he dropped all of that because he believed in the promise of a better life in the United States. We came to the U.S. as refugees from the Soviet Union, refugees from anti-Semitism, and he knew that the prospects for our lives would be very different than for his. He managed to break through some of those barriers and achieve, frankly, senior positions within government administration. Very charismatic, much better storyteller than I am, and he managed to prosper. But he knew that wasn't going to be the case for his children. That and the fact that my mother was dying of cancer, and he had read an article about the Shah of Iran getting treated in New York City for cancer, inspired him to drop everything, become designated an enemy of the state, give up we came here with suitcases. I think it was 1 suitcase per person or 2 suitcases per person. Anything that could be sold was sold to acquire hard currency. I remember my older brother, who's 6.5 years older, basically, while my dad was trying to navigate immigrating to the U.S. and maybe earning a couple of bucks in Italy, my older brother was out on this pier somewhere on a promenade selling the things that souvenirs that we could convert to hard currency. We were just there like little rugrats running around him while he at the age of 10 was trying to basically acting as a surrogate parent. So that's the way we. But to us, we didn't realize it was that hard. We had a kind of happy-go-lucky childhood. Didn't really recognize the things that we lacked. We were pretty blessed for the things that we had, which is a good family.
And why did you and all your brothers end up in the military? What is it about the military that drew all of you in?
I think that's, there were a couple of things. I think about this question pretty often, certainly have been asked about it. We all had an instinct to serve, to give back. I don't think that either my twin brother or I, who we both had long military careers, intended to have it as a career. We thought a 3 or 4 year stint in uniform, go on. I was supposed to be the doctor. I'm a big disappointment. He's an attorney, so he satisfied his requirements, and my older brother's a businessman. But it was supposed to be a short stint. But there were a couple of different things that lended to a career in the military. First of all, I was ill-disciplined rabble back then. Basically, not very focused on studies, very energetic, and I kind of somehow sensed that military discipline, something to focus my energies and expend my excess energies would be worthwhile. So after graduating from university, I thought, this sounds like fun. Let's go out, go do all the cool things, Ranger School, Airborne School, lead troops and stuff like that. So those are the initial impetus. But in reality, it turned out that it was probably one of the best decisions I've ever made, which was, it did allow me to kind of, first of all, become a lot more disciplined and focused. It also gave me the opportunity to identify public service as a passion for me. That every time I considered my options, whether it was time to move on, whether it was time to, pick a different career, there was a unique opportunity placed in front of me in the military. Whether it was leading troops into combat, whether it was becoming a foreign area officer, a diplomat in uniform, serving in the, picking up another language. I already spoke Russian in the home, so learning Ukrainian in the Defense Language Institute, going to Harvard for graduate school, getting a large, kind of tens of thousands of dollars and saying, hey, go ahead, travel this part of the world, learn everything you can about it. It's pretty amazing opportunity. And those were the kind of the opportunities as well as serving in the White House and the Pentagon, in Moscow and in Kiev. Those were pretty awesome opportunities at every turn. So it's pretty fortunate. Had a good career run. Nothing to complain about, maybe until the end.
And nothing to complain about. I love your story about the way you found your passion. You say you found a passion in the nature of military leadership. What is it about military leadership, and what's different about it?
I know there are a couple of vets in here, so I think this will hopefully resonate with them. It's pretty interesting leading troops from all across the country. As a platoon leader, having 40 guys, from cross-section of different parts of the country, trying to build that into a coherent team, something that could be effective in combat, and then graduating through to commanding larger and larger units. I think that's a challenge, and I definitely enjoy that challenge. I think in combat, it's even a more tougher type of challenge. In combat, an infantryman, their fundamental task is to destroy the enemy, and we understand that the driving force for human beings is self-preservation. So those two forces coming against each other pose some interesting challenges. It's not because there's a kind of a bloodlust or a need to do that, but there's an overarching mission that we get from under normal occasions from a national security process that says this is what you need to do to defend the country, to advance U.S. national security interests. So in serving that kind of higher purpose, it's a unique kind of challenge that you wouldn't face anywhere else in any other kind of occupation. And you do that, by not just shooting a gun, jumping out of planes, or, you do that by thinking. You think through how to conduct operations, how to preserve your own forces, keep them safe, how to achieve an objective. And in the U.S., which is very different, and I think the Ukrainians think this way, as opposed to the Russians, we do that where we value our troops' lives, but we also value the enemy's lives. So we do that in a way that's supposed to not create more suffering than it needs to. So you can see how all those different counter currents play together. It's quite a challenge, and I think you get some of the best leaders coming out of the military. Oftentimes, you have folks that could have probably done anything anywhere else, chosen a different kind of profession and mastered that profession, but instead chose to serve in uniform, to defend the country, to be a public servant.
I'm curious about your statement in your book about trusting your gut. Now, trusting your gut seems to be kind of the opposite of taking orders or following orders. In trusting your gut, though, and you're constantly interested in self-improvement, have you found ways to get better at that?
I think, frankly, one of the fundamental things about trusting your gut is experience. Unfortunately, it's hard to do that as a 20-year-old, 22-year-old. I don't think 22-year-olds are necessarily armed with the kind of the heuristics, the patterns that they could detect that allow them to make good decisions, because it's not kind of that. I think trusting your gut belies something else, that you've seen something that looks similar, and that you have enough information to make a judgment call about how to deal with this next kind of crisis. You can do that as you get older. You might not be. You might be a little bit slower sometimes. You're not. You don't have the stamina, endurance of a 22-year-old, but you have other kind of benefits, and that's experience. So I think trusting your gut for me was the combination of, in my case, some pretty interesting and unique training. I mean, I had the combat experience. I pride myself on being pretty attuned to my surroundings and kind of understanding where I am. That could be like concrete on a map, or it could be kind of just conceptual, like, just having a good sense of where the dangers lie. And I think that, plus the fact that as an attache you get some unique training to operate under the closest scrutiny from the Russian security services. I was in a position to be able to have a good gut instinct. Certainly when it came down to the White House and the perils, I was probably pretty well armed to understand that the kind of scrutiny I'd be under, and really, I guess, not make any major mistakes, not make any disastrous mistakes.
So in the White House, your job is to make really, really high stakes recommendations for war and peace. How do you critically self-assess yourself for blind spots?
I think oftentimes, certainly in the context of Russia and Ukraine, there were dangers. By the time I was serving in the White House, Russia and Ukraine were in a state of war already. So the question was for me, how do you prevent an escalation? And my conclusion was relatively straightforward. If U.S. resolve to support Ukraine seemed ironclad, was ironclad, if Ukraine was hardened against Russian attacks, meaning that it looked resilient internally, that it was kind of better armed to resist Russia, then that was a way to avoid a major escalation. And I think in general, under normal circumstances, frankly, that's a good something to think about in the context of the folks that are there in the White House now, the folks that are filling my position. How do they do their jobs right now to avoid a disastrous outcome or a major escalation? For me, it was a little bit easier. I mean, we were not in that kind of phase where the U.S. and was under direct threat of potentially being drawn into a hot war. In that situation, it was basically pushing back on Russian aggression, using all the tools at the U.S. government's disposal, as well as an alliance structure to warn off Russia. That seemed to work pretty well. It really wasn't until, in certain ways, it probably wasn't until some disastrous decisions as emerging from the Trump administration, including the hold on security assistance and impeachment, something that fractured U.S. Bipartisan support for Ukraine, bandwagoning and cheerleading for Putin, and demonizing Ukraine. That's when things probably became harder. For me, it was a simple question of how do you harden Ukrainian elections so they could have free and fair elections? How do you partner with them in certain areas to make their economy stronger? When the scandal started to unfold, it was a question about how do you lift the hold on security assistance? So in a lot of ways, much simpler problems than the team there faces today.
Let's turn to the war in Ukraine. On the subject of leadership, I'm wondering if the military does psychological mapping of opposing leaders like Putin. If so, how might such a psychological map game out Putin at the moment?
Sure. So the military doesn't do this habitually. They'll take a look at military leaders to a certain extent, but you have the CIA that does do this. The Central Intelligence Agency has a team of psychologists that I'm trying to think about. the folks that I'm familiar with, whether they're psychologists or psychiatrists, but they're professionals to be able to do a psychological profile. And I would say that I'm going to start with the kind of more dire aspects of it. They would conclude that he is increasingly isolated and detached from the facts on the ground, what's going on with his military, under increased pressure to try to pull out a win in this case. But in reality, fundamentally, he's somebody that's a survivor. He's somebody that looks rationally at the situation like he did before this war started, and believed that, through his lens, as skewed as it was, that he could achieve his objective, which is basically pull Ukraine back into the Russian orbit, either annex the country as a whole or put a puppet regime in there. And he did that based on kind of a rational principle. The rational principle was that for the 22 years that he served in government before that, the West tended to look the other way at his transgressions. The West didn't impose costs when he attacked democracy within his own country, expropriated kind of the media, and privatized it privatized it under the Putin regime. It's state-controlled, or conducted a brutal, barbaric war in Chechnya, or interfered in Ukraine's election, resulting in the Orange Revolution in 2004, or Georgia, or assassinations, or campaigns against journalists, or election interference in the U.S. I mean, there's a whole litany of things that he didn't bear significant costs for. And then why wouldn't he think that there was an opportunity there? We had just had an attack on the Capitol, an insurrection. The U.S. looked fractured and weakened. Hyperpolarization potentially put us on the cusp of, from his perspective, we looked a lot more brittle. He thought, maybe the U.S. was on the cusp of a civil war. He also, I think, calculated out that he could actually win and defeat Ukraine pretty quickly, and the costs from the Republican Party would be very mild. Because you have to remember that Trump was bandwagoning for Putin. Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, same thing. Lots of congressmen were doing the same thing. There are plenty of senators. When Senator Menendez from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was looking to levy sanctions on Russia to warn off a war, you had the Republicans slow rolling that process. So it looked, from his standpoint, quite viable. That was before this war started. From his calculations, again, made a lot of sense. I think he is still not quite, he probably still, frankly, doesn't understand how he's losing. He's a country of, he runs a country of 140 million people, the second most powerful military in the world. And he hasn't gotten his footing. And I think that now, there are some outlines on how he's going to make decisions going forward. He's not going to do something that risks himself or his regime or his legacy, as somebody that destroys Russia completely. So he's pretty reliable in that. I don't think he's in a position to escalate to nuclear war. That's not something that's going to happen for months at a time. But he is becoming more erratic.
Well, let me ask about the nuclear question. It's kind of hard to actually say it out loud.
Sure.
Talk about it. Let's say Putin did launch a tactical nuclear strike. If you were advising President Biden, how would you game out a response? And is there a U.S. response without a nuclear retaliation?
Yeah. So that's a very, very difficult question. I'm of two minds on this one. It warrants a unprecedented response. An unprecedented response with regards to sanctions, in regards to political isolation. I think at that point you could rally the kind of last pieces of the world that are still, open to cooperation with Russia. China and India would have to reject Russia. So those parts are kind of easy. I think the question is whether there's a military response, and I think there is. There's certainly a response that arms the Ukrainians to the teeth with anything and everything. There's no more kind of, if we were concerned about a nuclear escalation, we've already breached that kind of threshold. Then giving the Ukrainians everything they need to defend themselves, liberate their territory, there's, that's a minimum that we could do. There are some conversations about whether that's the point in time where NATO forces sink the Black Sea Fleet. There actually have been several, David Petraeus, General David Petraeus, former director for CIA, said that that's one of the consequences. I think that's a good message to send ahead of time to warn the Russians off, to kind of introduce that notion of doubt about the consequences, that they lose their entire Black Sea Fleet, and the kind of my thought would be to not pursue that course of action, because thus far the U.S. and NATO have managed to stay out of a direct confrontation that could lead to a bilateral confrontation. And my instinct would be to not breach that, especially when nuclear weapons have already been used. But I think that's a viable option, because there is still a huge gap between a conventional fight between NATO and Russia and a nuclear fight. I think there is something to be said about using conventional U.S. and NATO nuclear force to punish Russia, to indicate how serious this nuclear attack is, how it ruptures kind of every other remaining norm that we had about avoiding confrontation, and then warning Russia that, frankly, we are ready for to respond if Russia continues to use nuclear weapons. Using conventional forces may very well be the ultimate nuclear deterrent, right? Because then the Russians know that we're not just ready to talk, we're ready to take action. But there are significant risks, because that could be something that starts a spiral towards a nuclear escalation. I could tell you what I would be doing now, though, because that hypothetical scenario is easily 3, potentially 6 months away, because there are just so many steps between now and then. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it would take us about 3 to 6 months to hit all those intermediate steps, all those precursors to a nuclear exchange, which is at the very, very end of the road, not the beginning of the road. So between now and then, what I would do is I would basically do my job as a national security staffer. I'd convene all the smartest people that there are in government and kind of evaluate these options. I'd want to not just kind of take my own preconceived notions. What you had me do is just kind of think through this problem in front of you, all of you, so you could see how that worked out. But I would want to test some of those propositions, and I would want to see, I'd want to kind of think through, is a conventional response to Russia, is sinking the Black Sea Fleet the right way to deter Russia, or is that more likely to escalate? And I'd take this all the way through what's called a National Security Council meeting, which would be the president chairing all the principals from government, and have a really good idea on how to respond to the situation. I'm very confident in saying that's already happening, that these types of planning sessions are underway to think through this kind of scenario. And then let me reassure you on the note that I say that nuclear escalation is it's the last thing. It's not the first thing. So there just haven't been any indicators that show that we're moving in this direction. The closest thing that's happened is that the Russians attacked those gas pipelines, Nord Stream pipelines. That's the first kind of attack on NATO infrastructure. But before you see the use of nuclear weapons all the way over here, you would expect to see weapons of mass destruction be employed, chemical, biological. You could see a nuclear accident, an attack on a power plant in Ukraine that causes a nuclear incident to demonstrate that the Russians are ready to go there. You could see cyber attacks. You could see a whole host of different things unfolding in the preceding months before the situation that would indicate we're marching towards nuclear use. And we just haven't seen any of those. I think Putin's been very, very careful thus far to use all of the flowery rhetoric that he wants on the fact that the West is behind this, that he's fighting the West, but he's not lashed out at the West. And if we end up there, then we know that we're starting on that path. But we haven't even started on that road, really. I hope that makes you feel better.
A little bit. I have a hard time with the 3 to 6 months.
That's my assessment of how long it would take us to run the gambit of all these precursors. But I think, this is why when some of you may have heard me talk, I talk about the hazards of a long war, of a war that lasts another 6, 9 months, 12 months, is that, we could actually start seeing these chipping away at deterrence, chipping away at, these, or hitting the markers of these indications and warnings. And that's why my prescription is really quite straightforward. I would like this administration to do more to help Ukraine win a shorter war than engage in a longer war that allows us to go through all these different steps.
But we're going to go through a winter here, right? Doesn't war kind of stop for a while?
Definitely not. I would say that there'll be some reductions. I think the Russians, frankly, in fact, have prided themselves on being able to conduct cold weather operations. This war started in February at a high up tempo. I think it's going to continue. There might be some reductions. I would say that you could see the Russians trying to hunker down and hold their lines, and somewhere away from the war. If they were smart, they would take all these troops that they mobilized and trying to shape them into a fighting force. But the Ukrainians are absolutely going to continue to liberate territory and make gains. The Russians are going to do the best they can to hold and see if there's a way for them to conduct a spring and summer offensive. I think there's at least one more spring-summer offensive at this point because of how long the war has gone in the Russians. There's a small chance, and this is, I'd say right now it's kind of a low probability outcome that the Russians break. I think in the next several weeks we'll see Kherson, certainly before the winter, Kherson is probably going to be liberated. And that is a very strategic location. What it does is it pushes Russians across this massive river, the Dnieper River, which is like a kilometer wide and in some of the narrower spots, much wider than that in the wider spots. And that allows it's kind of a natural obstacle. That means that all those forces that were there could reposition to other areas and squeeze the Russians out of the east and start to squeeze the Russians out of the south. I think there's a small chance of that happening, especially since right now the Ukrainians are continuing to liberate territory in the east. And they're building forces in the one direction that nobody's really discussed right now is Zaporozhye, the one that if you draw an arrow from the center all the way to Mariupol, that city that was under siege for a long time, there's a good chance that the Ukrainians might launch an offensive there. And if they're successful, then Russia's in an untenable situation. They'll chew up large portions of the Russian forces, probably surround and capture and destroy large numbers of Russian formations, and that could frankly compel Putin to look for terms, look for a way to hang on to what he can, which is probably Crimea for the short term.
Yeah, you asked me about feeling good, and I think I would feel better if we can talk about an end game. So President Biden at a private fundraiser said he's not aware of an exit ramp for Putin. That's the way he put it. How would you, if you were advising Biden, how would you see an exit ramp?
I would say...
what's the end here?
Sure. I think there are only bad and worse options for Putin. The worst option is nuclear escalation, because it really doesn't necessarily gain him anything. I don't think that the Ukrainians necessarily buckle over the use of 1, 2, 3 nuclear weapons potentially. You'd have to use them against major cities, and but that would change kind of the world permanently. That would be the beginning of nuclear war. Nuclear wars going forward. So I think that's the worst of all options for him. I think worst option is taking something like hanging on to Crimea. That's quite a viable option to him. He could hang on to Crimea, not necessarily even permanently, but at least prevent the Ukrainians from launching attacks to liberate it. I think the Ukrainians are open to that, or have been up until this recent annexation that occurred within the past several weeks. The Ukrainians were happy to set aside that question for the short term and let that play out diplomatically over the course of years. I think Putin's annexation kind of upset the apple cart and maybe kind of eliminated the unique kind of status of Crimea, that it was off limits because it was annexed Russian territory. But I think there's a scenario in which that still is a viable course of action. It's not that the Ukrainians give up on Crimea, they just let that play out in a less acute manner over the course of time. So I think that's closer to what the end game is going to look like. I don't see a scenario in which the Russians really are able to turn the corner and regain momentum. The way they're using their troops that they partially mobilized looks like they're feeding them into the fight, unprepared. That's not a recipe for success. So I think the end game is really closer to when the Ukrainians could break the Russian forces in Ukraine and liberate large chunks of territory, forcing Putin to negotiate. So it's not like it's not like when we talk about face-saving measures and off-ramps, it's not a kind of scenario where Putin really walks away with a major win. He just walks away with enough to keep his regime intact and deal in a position to deal with pressures back home. And I think that's the ultimate scenario here. Sometimes when even the president ruminates on this topic of face-saving measures and off-ramps, it lends itself to this notion that we have to offer something. We have to offer an enticement to Russia. But that just doesn't work with Russia. I think the fact is that they would bank whatever it is that we're offering and look for more. So it's really from a position of weakness that Putin engages in fulsome peace negotiations, armistice, whatever the case might be, not from something that we give him, but what the Ukrainians deliver on the battlefield.
Yeah, so it's totally up to the battlefield. There's no off-ramp that we can offer. It just we have to finally win these battles.
Yep.
For Putin to create his own, design his own off-ramp.
Well, that's exactly right. Putin does need to design his own off-ramp, but we should also not kind of fall victim to some sort of hubris about what we can do in this situation. We are not on the ground. We are providing equipment. And really, for a large portion of this war, we provided kind of just enough equipment. So the simple fact is that now the U.S. is in no position to, unless Ukraine does something, disastrous, which they're not going to do, we're not in a position to shut off support for Ukraine. The American population would really have some serious questions about the leadership of in the White House if we showed that kind of weakness and if we buckled in that way. I think it would have a disastrous effect potentially on election cycles here in 2024. So it's untenable for us to really significantly change our approach to Ukraine. We could go up, but we really can't go down. That would not be politically viable. So how do we pressure the Ukrainians to do anything? We can't. We don't have enough leverage. We can't withdraw troops. We really probably can't really reduce the level of support they're getting now, at least not easily. And the Ukrainians are the ones that are delivering these blows to the Russians and winning on the battlefield. We're kind of a sideshow to a certain extent. It's the Ukrainians that are the main act.
So you say the Ukrainians have the momentum. What would be your advice to Zelensky not to mess it up?
That is probably, a lot of that is internal Ukrainian politics. There were some undercurrents before this war started where the Zelensky administration wasn't living up to its potential. It didn't do enough on anti-corruption, it didn't do enough on reform, and it really was centralizing power and eliminating other pockets of potentially competing power centers. And one of the worst things that they could do is try to do that now, because one of the biggest power centers is the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff, the armed forces. The head of the Ukrainian armed forces, General Zaluzhny, is very, very popular. And at some point, there have been rumblings and some jealousies about how popular he was. It would be a disaster if he tried to switch out the commander of the armed forces. That would be a terrible idea to try to do that in the war. And it would probably cause a huge backlash against him. In the short term, there's probably not a huge, he's well practiced. He's been doing this for 8 months, something like 8 months almost. So I think he knows what his role is. He knows that he needs to communicate with the public. He needs to continue to rally the Western world. I don't think there's that much. It's unlikely that there's really anything that really could upset the direction. It's whether he breaks trust with his population. That could be really the biggest mistake he could make.
The long run, what's your picture in the future, say after the war, Ukraine, Europe, and Russia? How do you see it working out?
Sure. So Russia will be greatly diminished. It's going to take decades to build back a military. I think there are multiple different scenarios for Russia going forward. I don't see a scenario in which Putin is out of power, in the next several months, 6 months. I think there's a mark on the wall that I have in my mind, which is 2024, when his current term expires, that he'll do what he did in 2008, switch positions with the prime minister. There'll be a different face on the country. There's an opportunity for the West to kind of, oh, look, there's an opportunity, it's a different leader. Let's welcome back Russia. So I think I could see something like that unfolding. There's a kind of a difficult scenario in which there is growing unrest within the various ethnic communities in Russia. Russia could fracture. Russia could shrink and lose some of the colonial holdings. Some of these that have been part of Russia for mere couple hundred years. Frankly, there are places in the North Caucasus that are relatively recent acquisitions, like early 19th century. And then there are places that have been part of Russia going back to the 16th century or so. It was when Russia started to expand. And these are ethnic, kind of homogeneous ethnic communities. I could see there's a risk that some of these unwind, because the Russians are racist and chauvinist, and they've been using these ethnic communities to fight their war with massive casualties. Now they have to use Russians, ethnic Russians, to fight this war, and that's creating some unrest. But this could really, this is a remote scenario, but it's a possible scenario now that Russia unwinds. It was too big to kind of hold together, and this war is what kind of causes it to collapse. Ukraine, I think, is a democratic tiger. I could see it being an economic tiger, integrating into Europe, being rebuilt, especially with the EU accession program, receiving hundreds of billions of dollars. I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs on this, but I could see hundreds of billions of dollars pouring into Ukraine from like a Marshall Plan, grants and loans, hopefully mainly grants from both the EU and the US. We would have a relatively modest role in that. I think hundreds of billions would come from the EU. I think we would contribute tens of billions. I could see Russian reparations, frozen Russian assets being used to rebuild Ukraine. and I could see private equity eventually coming in. And right now, for those of you that that have traveled to Ukraine and understand how difficult it is to do business there, it would be a different kind of Ukraine than what we may have experienced in the past. Mainly because they would, in EU accession, they would have to hit specific benchmarks with regards to reforms and tamping down on corruption in order to actually join the EU. That would also allow them to build the kind of environment that they need for investment, for private equity. And this is, so I talk about this kind of Ukraine. I also see, a somewhat revitalized EU based on the energy that they get from Ukraine joining. And I see, this decline, the surging tide of authoritarianism starting to ebb, and democracies, showing their strength. It's interesting. Certainly, our adversaries, the Chinese, recently there was a report on the Chinese being a little bit dumbfounded by the notion that the democratic world consolidated the way it did around pushing back on authoritarianism. So I think because of Ukraine, we face a because of this country of 40 million, in the middle of Europe, thousands of miles away, we face, frankly, a much better prospect for the 21st century than we did before this war, on the backs of the Ukrainians, with Ukrainian spilled blood. And I think that's probably going to be the story that's told decades from now.
Speaking about decades from now, or decades long ago, President Kennedy gave a visionary speech in 1963 after the Cuban Missile Crisis, saying the nature of war had to change. How are top thinkers today pondering the nature of war changing?
That's a tough question. I think as a military officer serving in Middle East wars, I was pretty disappointed with the military leadership and how they conducted 20 years of war. Too many half-truths about how the war was going to shape up. And if we just stayed a little bit longer, pressed a little bit harder, that would be successful. Turned out to be a lie. And President Biden had the courage to pull the plug on those wars. Unfortunately, there's a human toll there, certainly for the Afghan population. But an Afghan population that under 20 years of U.S. military personnel serving there had at least a glimpse of what a prosperous kind of free future might be. My impression is that the military has this way of rationalizing things, which is deeply troubling. That there were other causes for the loss of the war. That it was the political class instead of the military leadership, senior military leaders. So right now, I don't see kind of a deep introspection on what we're learning from this war. It's possible we might get something out of this war between Russia and Ukraine that might get us to be a little bit more thoughtful. I hope that the greatest learning is not within the military. We have a pretty powerful military, even with our shortcomings, and the mistakes that we could continue to repeat. But it's amongst the political class that chooses to wage war and how we prepare for war. The biggest thing that I think we could do as a nation when we think about war is not think about immediate risks, short-term dangers, but think about the long-term threats to to the rules-based international order. And I think the way we ended up in this conflict is that we constantly made short-term decisions about risks. We made the decisions that we didn't need to challenge Russia in its undemocratic and anti-democratic turn, and as it attacked its neighbors, because there were other more important things in that moment in time. But what we should have realized is that it's the democratic world that really offers the U.S. strength and offers the environment for U.S. prosperity. So if we adhere to kind of the values that would be the compass that directs our national security interest also, and that we don't just succumb to short-term interests. We think about the long-term pictures and the decisions we make.
Well, what is the biggest change you think America should make in its foreign policy?
I assess that the U.S. too often under the various administrations with regards to Putin succumbed to hopes and fears. Hopes, aspirations that we could do more than we could, just by force of will, that we could get the Russians to be better actors, that there was more that we could do with regards to cooperation, or fears that if we took a principled stand, that it could devolve into a Cold War. So one of the biggest things I think we could do is understand to a certain extent the limits of U.S. power, look for willing partnerships, like if we invested in Ukraine, since about 2004, since the Orange Revolution, we hardened Ukraine. We helped nurture a relationship with Ukraine that they would potentially they would be unpalatable for Russia to lash out at, and put the whole world on the brink of, again, there's a huge gap, but closer to a nuclear war than we've been in a long time. We're not that close, but closer than we have been. So I think there's something to be said about understanding our shortcomings and in terms of foreign policy, that we succumb to short-termism instead of thinking about kind of long-term trajectories for our relationships, and then looking for partnerships where we have willing partners on the other side, not folks that we have to kind of coerce or force to be our partners.
So that could be Europe, or even Ukraine as a power, a tighter partnership with Europe. And
I think that's exactly what we're shaping up for. I think it's going to be Europe, including Ukraine, EU, including Ukraine. Eventually, it's probably going to be Ukraine as a part of NATO. Although the joke in Kiev is, NATO should petition to join Ukraine.
Yeah,
as well as they're forming. But I think that's the kind of future that we just need to get through this perilous next 6-9 months, a year and a half, and on the back end, things are going to look better.
And my last question for you is, what's next for you? Your father kept saying his big motto was not only just start over, but keep starting over.
Sure. So a lot of interesting things. I submitted my doctoral thesis. I already received feedback, so I need to revise it and defend it. So that's not too far off in the near future. That'll be kind of it was very rewarding, but a lot of work. So I'll get past that. I'm working with a group called VoteVets. It's a progressive veterans group to advocate for basically our ethic and values, to unseat unprincipled insurrectionists, the insurrection caucus, as I like to refer to it. So I get to lend my voice in that way. That's been pretty rewarding. Taking swings against some of these nefarious actors and supporting good candidates. I run a national security program within VoteVets. It allows me to craft very quick but quality advice on emerging challenges, everything from Russia, Ukraine. I brief Congress on a regular basis. I talk to the White House. They usually don't listen. And it's also looking at extremism in the ranks, a whole bunch of different things. China is going to be something that we take a closer look at in the future. It's just not a kind of an acute issue at the moment. And then I'm trying to be more entrepreneurial. So one of the things I was in Kiev recently, because I saw a major gap in their ability to conduct this war, which was simply all this Western equipment needs to be serviced. It needs to be repaired, and right now it's being repaired 1,000 kilometers from the front. It's like a car breaks down in New York, you don't ship it to Chicago to get it fixed, right? So Fortunately, we live in the United States. I don't have to ask permission from the U.S. government. I just need to raise capital and pull together a team. And I'm looking to put a facility inside Ukraine where they could service this equipment. So that's kind of a project I'm keenly focused on. Just all sorts of good works and see what comes of it.
Let me use your dad's motto for starting over, because we're giving you a gift clock. So when you look at it, you can remind yourself that it's your time.
Okay.
Thank you very much for a beautiful evening. And you're a lovely audience. We could feel your vibe. Thank you so much. And Colonel Vindman will sign your books and greet you. Thanks again for joining us. Please consider a donation and get your copy of Here, Right Matters at the link. Until next time, take good care.